Anarchism is a tendency which holds that hierarchies which fail to prove their legitimacy should be dismantled to increase the scope of human liberty. Anarchists advocate a stateless society in which the means of production are held in common and industry and communities are organised democratically by means of decentralised free federation. Modern anarchists, so long as they're consistent in their anarchism, also oppose racism, sexism, queerphobia and ableism. Because we take this unique position on the political compass of rejecting hierarchy altogether, we are reviled by people who advocate all kinds of hierarchical systems. Liberals, Leninists, etc. Anarchism is one of the most misunderstood and misrepresented tendencies. In this video, I want to respond to common arguments against anarchism. An anarchist society would be rife with antisocial behaviour. Individuals could be, for example, physically violent towards others, or they could rob people of their possessions, and there would be no repercussions for these kinds of actions. In an anarchist society, someone who gets a kick out of being horrible to others would be free to terrorise the community as they see fit. Importantly, anarchists hold that freedom to limit others' freedom is no freedom at all. We want a society run by means of horizontal, democratically controlled federations. Within that institutional framework, people could collectively determine codes of conduct in an anarchist manner to address and respond to any antisocial behaviour that might arise. In present organisations such as AFED, there are codes of conduct against oppressive behaviour, abuse, harassment, etc. I don't have a blueprint for exactly how those kinds of procedures would work in a large-scale society because I think that's for participants in the future society to decide. Nevertheless, the point stands that anarchism does not mean everyone does what they want, no matter the harm to others. Secondly, anarchists generally argue that the majority of antisocial behaviour occurs as a result of hierarchical systems. Under capitalism, the ruling class appropriate the products of the labour of the workers, leaving everyone else fighting for scraps, lashing out in violence, and committing robberies out of necessity. In The Spirit Level by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson, evidence is given to show that economic inequality damages mental and physical health, corrodes trust, and increases violence and anxiety. The introduction of a socialist system where the means of production are democratically controlled would eliminate structural poverty and the crime that goes with it. We could also massively reduce sexual violence by abolishing patriarchy, normalising sex positivity, and providing people with a robust and comprehensive understanding of consent and human relationships from an early age. The overarching point here is that the relations of equality and solidarity created by an anarchist social order would eliminate the structural causes of most crimes to the extent that police and prisons would be unnecessary. Finally, in a hierarchical society, power structures exist where those who get a kick out of being horrible to others can gain tremendous influence and get away with their crimes scot-free. A society structured in an anarchist manner would stop these people from gaining such influence and nip the problem in the bud. Anarchists are not under the illusion that everybody would be perfect in an anarchist society. Rather, we think that an anarchist society would create conditions under which the likelihood of antisocial behaviour would be dramatically reduced. Responses to such behaviour could be democratically organised, and there would not be centres of power through which those individuals could do far more damage than they would in a horizontal society. Anarchism only works on a small scale. There are billions of people in the world. Horizontalism could not work on that scale. Horizontalism does not mean that we don't have any kind of delegation when that's necessary to organise in large groups. For example, in a large federation with huge numbers of people and lots of groups in different localities, it's just not practically feasible to have decisions taken in one giant meeting of every single member of the federation. Delegation means that each of the local groups in a federation comes to a decision democratically, and instead of the giant meeting, we have a delegate meeting in which the decisions of the local groups are gathered by delegates from each group, allowing for the local groups to effectively work together and take decisions as a mass body. Delegates can be selected typically by direct democracy, lottery, picking names out of a hat, or rotation, people taking turns. They are instantly recallable should they fail to do their democratic duties properly. Delegates are not politicians, considering they're not a ruling class and they don't control any kind of centralised state apparatus. Crucially, they don't make decisions for other people. The people decide and then they take the message. Delegation presents a non-hierarchical solution to the practical question of large-scale organisation. An example of this kind of delegation in action would be in the organisation of healthcare in Barcelona during the Spanish Revolution. Barcelona was divided into 9 zones, each with its own syndicate, and delegates from each zone would come together into a committee that would deal with common problems and implement a common plan. The Spanish Revolution from 1936 to 1939 was the largest example of an anarchist society, in which, according to Frank Mintz, 1,838,000 people were involved in collectivization and self-management. Sam Dolgoff's estimate is much higher at around 8 million. The population of the less well-known Ukrainian Free Territory was around 7 million. So anarchism in practice is not just a small hippie commune in the woods. We have the tools to make it work for millions of people. Production and consumption guided by the principle from each according to their ability to each according to their need would never work. Under communism, everybody would just greedily take stuff, and nobody would bother to do the unpleasant work. First of all, to each according to their need does not necessarily mean everyone would just consume to excess in practice. For example, if you go to a library, you don't just take as many books as possible, you take the books you need. An interesting example is all-you-can-eat buffets. A 2011 study of an all-you-can-eat pizza restaurant found that when the buffet was more expensive, people ate more to try to get their money's worth. They ate less when they had a discount, even though in both cases they could eat as much as they want. In other words, they could take according to need. If money weren't involved at all, would people just gorge themselves? No, they'd just eat to satisfy the need for a full stomach. When it comes to people doing the unpleasant work, there are a number of points to make. The first is that if the means of production were held in common, much of the unpleasant work could be automated. Secondly, we could decide democratically to share the remaining unpleasant work among the community, perhaps by means of rotation. Thirdly, by abolishing unnecessary and bureaucratic jobs, we would have more people to share the work among. Finally, in a communitarian anarchist society, work would be self-managed, which would make it far less unpleasant. More generally, the institutions of such a society would foster a sense of belonging. By doing this work, people would know that they are contributing to the good of society and the satisfaction of human needs. For those reasons, I think people would choose to do the necessary, unpleasant work under anarchist communism. But aren't hierarchies just natural? Anarchism goes against human nature. Human beings do have a nature. We need food, shelter, sleep, we reproduce from sex, and so on. Furthermore, psychologists Ed Deci and Richard Ryan founded self-determination theory, which posits that humans have innate psychological needs for competence, relatedness, and autonomy, and that these needs exist across cultures. We need to feel like we're effective in dealing with the environment around us, and that we're good at what we do. We need to feel connected to other people, and we need control over our lives. To the extent that those needs are met, we thrive, and to the extent that they are thwarted, we become ill and alienated. Anarchists argue that hierarchical systems produce illness and alienation, whereas systems based on horizontal, free cooperation create the conditions for human flourishing. In my opinion, this is because horizontal systems are more appropriate to satisfy our innate needs for things like competence, relatedness, and autonomy than hierarchical systems. I have a full video on this called Anarchism and Human Nature, which goes into more detail on these points. I disagree with anarchists who claim that there is no human nature. Given the findings of self-determination theory, the idea that hierarchies go with the grain of human nature is dubious. It disregards the negative psychological impact that domination has on those who are subjected to it by depriving them of autonomy. human nature arguments for hierarchy seem to merely defend power on the grounds of the felt experience of exercising it, which is seriously ethically questionable. The claim that hierarchical systems are built into our nature is an extremely conservative argument masquerading as realism, and the science just doesn't support it. But everyone naturally gravitates towards cultivating different sets of skills and abilities. Doesn't that mean that people who are particularly good at something will be deferred to? And doesn't that make hierarchy inevitable? Anarchists conceive of liberty as the possibility of engaging in self-directed activity through which one can develop human capacities to the fullest extent. We advocate equality of liberty, meaning we want the possibility of self-improving, self-directed activity to be equally available to everyone. Anarchists distinguish between competent authority and hierarchical authority. Hierarchical authority is placing limitations on liberty, whereas competent authority is when an individual is deferred to for their skills and knowledge in a given area. An example of competent authority would be deferring to a good doctor for appropriate medical advice. In this case, an individual recognises that they need medical advice and that their own knowledge is insufficient to satisfy this need, so the constraints of their own reasoning lead them to defer to the good doctor with the relevant knowledge. Deferring to someone for their knowledge does not limit your self-directed activity and human development, and so competent authority does not violate liberty. The fact that humans tend towards diverse interests means that competent authority will inevitably emerge from equality of liberty. Under communism, where all things are for all and everyone has access to the means of developing whatever skills and abilities they choose, competent authority doesn't have to be transmuted into hierarchical authority. People can specialise in an egalitarian society. There's just no monopolisation of resources that means certain professions are the reserve of a few, while everyone else is condemned to drudgery. Now, let's consider some of the criticisms that Marxists, especially Leninists, make about anarchism. To achieve a socialist or communist society, you need to coercively expropriate capitalists, and you need to defend the revolution against reactionary forces. How can that be done without a state? Anarchists agree on the necessity of coercive expropriation to establish socialism. For anarchists, a state is a hierarchical and centralised institution with a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, governed by a class of professional rulers. However, coercive expropriation of capitalists and revolutionary defence can be organised by federations of horizontal workers' councils and workers' militias, and because these institutions are non-hierarchical, they aren't a state. They might be a state in the Marxist sense of the term. However, if you're trying to refute anarchism on this point, you have to prove that the state, in the sense that the anarchists define it, is necessary to carry out coercive expropriation and revolutionary defence. If you just say that federations of horizontal workers' councils and militias are a state, and then say, see, why would you be an anarchist, you're actually just missing the point of why anarchists critique hierarchical organisation and the political class, and you're failing to justify that particular kind of system. The seizure of state power is an extremely effective way of crushing a socialist revolution. Historically, the ruling classes that have governed states have always acted to destroy the institutions of workers' control. So seizing state power isn't a good means of defending a revolution, but rather crushing it. The Soviet Union, China, Cuba, and the actions of the communists in Spain, France, and Ukraine, attacking self-management during the Spanish Revolution, trying to contain the French wave of wildcat strikes in May 1968, and crushing the Ukrainian Makhnovist movement are all examples of how Leninist methods are profoundly counter-revolutionary in practice. Anarchists don't realise that Marxists and Leninists want to smash the existing state machinery and replace the capitalist state with a workers' state. They conflate the two because they think all states are bad. Anarchists would respond to this by arguing that if by the state we mean the hierarchical institution as previously defined, then there can be no workers' state, precisely for the reasons mentioned earlier, that the ruling class governing the state represents its own distinct interests rather than those of the working class. Again, we think that federations of workers' militias and councils are good, but we don't define that as a state. In practice, Leninists don't replace the state machinery with these kinds of organisation, but in fact leave the hierarchical system intact, regardless of the libertarian-sounding rhetoric Lenin used in State and Revolution. Anarchism is just bourgeois individualism, because they centre individual freedom rather than collective organisation as the basis of their politics. This is probably the weakest critique that Marxists and Leninists make of anarchists, as it just shows a lack of basic understanding of anarchist theory and practice. We have historically understood liberty as an eminently social phenomenon. In Man, Society and Freedom, Bakunin wrote, "The materialistic, realistic and collectivist conception of freedom, as opposed to the idealistic, is this. Man becomes conscious of himself and his humanity only in society and only by the collective action of the whole society. He frees himself from the yoke of external nature only by collective and social labour, which alone can transform the earth into an abode favourable to the development of humanity. Without such material emancipation, the intellectual and moral emancipation of the individual is impossible." We can of course disregard Bakunin's typical use of the default man here, but nevertheless the points about freedom stand. The individual is only able to fully develop themselves as part of a community. The Makhnovists in Ukraine and the CNT in Spain illustrated the anarchist values of collective organisation in practice historically. The charge that anarchists don't centre collective organisation in our politics is false. Also, generally decrying anarchists for caring about individual freedom does a disservice to some of the most positive ideas within Marxism, namely that communism provides the appropriate conditions for the emancipation of the individual. So, those are my responses to some of the major objections to anarchism. I hope that you've enjoyed this series, that you found it informative and accessible, and that any misconceptions you might have had about anarchism were put to rest. I also hope that you're inspired to join anarchist organisations in your area, or start one if they don't exist yet, and take action to change the world. I'm going to upload the transcripts for this series to the Anarchist Library. I've enjoyed putting this together. I think that it's a big improvement on the old series. I've tried to take a lot more care with the arguments and the structure, and also to try to promote more of an intersectional vision of anarchism. Many thanks to my contributors on Patreon: Brandon Halkus Tischer, Comrade Dr. Fraser Crane, Cyclodeon, Deviath Fur, Flagburner, Jack Bryant, Joe Martin, Comrade Klaus, Luke Smith, Marty, Michael Norling, Patrick Gordon, Richard Pearson, Vrisha Drires, and XXX Swagmaster 420 XXX. This has been Libertarian Socialist Rants. Thanks for watching.